The warm summer breeze fluttered through the lace curtains, casting shifting shadows on the dining room's hardwood floor. Charles sat at the table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Though he hadn't taken a sip, his fingers rhythmically tapped on the surface of the table. Diane moved about the kitchen, chopping vegetables with clear intent. Without looking up, she spoke. "Charles, you've been unusually quiet today." She rinsed the knife under the tap and set it down on the counter. "Is something bothering you?" Charles hesitated, unsure if he was ready to open up. His eyes drifted to Stella, who was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She hummed a soft melody, her voice nearly cheerful, as if the revelation from the previous night hadn't shaken Charles's trust. "I'm just thinking," he finally muttered. He glanced at Stella for a moment too long, and she turned to meet his gaze with a fleeting, unreadable smile. "Well, think less and act more," Diane said with a light laugh, pouring iced tea into a glass and setting it in front of him. "You always overthink things, Charles. Relax a little." Charles forced a weak smile. Diane's cheerful obliviousness grated on him. He felt the overwhelming urge to shout the truth, to tell her what he had discovered, but he swallowed it down. "Stella, do you need help with anything?" Diane asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Stella turned with her usual poised smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Everything's under control." Her voice was as smooth as ever. Charles noticed her red-painted nails tapping against the wooden spoon as she stirred. It was the same color she wore on nights she claimed to be out with friends. A flash of the message he'd read the night before flashed through his mind. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was unforgettable." The sender's name had sent a chill through him. Nathan. Charles clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. "Charles, you're staring off into space again," Diane said as she sat across from him. "Are you feeling okay?" He snapped out of his thoughts. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." "Well, you better not let whatever it is ruin your appetite. Stella worked hard on this lunch," Diane said, her voice carrying a slight reprimand. Charles's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen. Another message from Nathan, this time with no subject line. His stomach turned. "Who's that?" Stella asked, not looking up from the pot. "Just work," Charles lied, locking the phone and shoving it into his pocket. "Can't they give you a break on weekends?" Diane sighed. Charles nodded absently, but his mind was racing. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. For weeks he had noticed Stella's late-night texts, secretive calls, and unexplained outings. The evidence was undeniable, but he'd been in denial. The discovery from the previous night left no room for doubt. After Stella had fallen asleep, he had seen her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Curiosity, mixed with growing suspicion, had driven him to pick it up. The message from Nathan had confirmed everything he feared. "Lunch is ready," Stella announced, interrupting his thoughts. She carried the steaming pot to the table and set it down with practiced ease. Charles watched her closely as she moved, her expression serene. How could she act so normal? Didn't she feel any guilt? As they ate, the conversation flowed around him like a distant hum. Diane and Stella talked about weekend plans, the kids' school activities, and the weather. Charles barely participated, his mind elsewhere. "You're hardly touching your food," Diane remarked. Charles poked at his plate with his fork. "I'm not very hungry." "Don't be silly," Diane said. "You need to eat. You've got a family to take care of." "A family?" Charles thought bitterly. "Is that what this is?" Stella caught his eye, her smile faltering for the first time that day. "Charles, is something wrong?" For a moment he considered confronting her right there in front of Diane, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he shook his head. "I'm fine. Just tired." Diane chuckled. "You always work too hard. No wonder you're exhausted." Stella reached across the table to touch his hand. Her fingers were cold. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me," she said. Charles pulled his hand back, pretending to adjust his watch. "I said I'm fine." The rest of the meal passed in strange silence. Afterward, Diane began clearing the table, and Stella retreated to the living room with a cup of coffee. Charles lingered in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared out the window. Diane approached softly, standing beside him. "You're not yourself today," she said gently. "I know when something's wrong." He looked at her, his face a mask of control. "It's nothing, Mom," She frowned, unconvinced, but didn't press the issue. As the afternoon passed, Charles found himself pacing in the backyard. He pulled out his phone and reread Nathan's message for the 10th time, his blood boiling. Stella stepped outside, her footsteps light on the patio. "Charles!" she called. He turned to face her, his expression hard. "What do you want?" She tilted her head, her smile faint but still present. "You've been avoiding me all day. If something's wrong, just say it." For a moment, Charles almost spoke the truth, but he held back, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I told you I'm tired. That's all." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she walked back inside, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles sat on the patio, staring into the growing dusk. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever, but how would he confront her? How could he face his brother? For now, he would wait. He needed a plan, a way to navigate the storm without losing everything he had built. And so, the evening ended as it had begun, with secrets hanging in the air, waiting to be unraveled. The clinking of silverware filled the room as the family gathered around the dinner table. Charles's fork hovered above his plate, untouched. Across from him, Stella laughed brightly at one of Diane's stories about their neighbor's unruly dog. Her laugh grated on him, a sharp reminder of the lie their life had become. "And you wouldn't believe it, Charles," Diane was saying, her hands animated as she spoke. "The dog jumped right into their pool. Poor Mr. Harris was livid." Stella chuckled, covering her mouth delicately. "He always did have a temper. Maybe the dog was trying to teach him to loosen up." Charles forced a smile, the muscles in his face tightening. He couldn't focus on their words. His thoughts circled back to the message, Nathan's name glowing on the screen, and the sickening confirmation that his wife and brother had betrayed him. "Charles, are you even listening?" Diane asked, raising an eyebrow. He looked up abruptly. "Yeah, just thinking." "You've been doing a lot of that lately," Diane said, narrowing her eyes. "Is something wrong?" "No, it's fine," he replied quickly, glancing at Stella. She met his gaze with a slight tilt of her head, her expression unreadable. The meal dragged on, Charles's anger simmering just beneath the surface. He replayed scenarios in his mind. How to confront her, what to say, whether he could hold back the storm of emotions threatening to burst. Finally, unable to take it any longer, he set his fork down deliberately. "Stella," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Can we talk privately?" The conversation at the table came to a halt. Diane glanced between them, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Now?" Stella's smile faltered. "Yes, now," Charles replied, not breaking eye contact. Stella hesitated, her fingers tightening around her glass of water. "All right." She stood, smoothing her dress, and followed him down the hallway to their bedroom. Charles closed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment before turning to face her. "What's this about?" she asked, crossing her arms. Charles's throat was dry as he searched for the right words. Finally, he spoke. "I know about you and Nathan." For a moment, her face froze. The confident facade slipped and her eyes widened. Then just as quickly she recovered, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "Oh," she said casually, sitting on the edge of the bed. "So, you know, is that all you have to say?" Charles asked, his voice rising. "You're not even going to deny it?" She shrugged, the smirk deepening. "What's the point? You've clearly made up your mind. So, what are you going to do? Cry about it?" Her casual dismissal hit him like a punch to the gut. He stepped forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "Why, Stella? Why would you do this to us? To our family? Why?" she repeated, tilting her head as if the question were ridiculous. "Maybe because you're so dull, Charles. You work, come home, play with the kids, and then go to bed. Where's the excitement? Where's the passion?" Charles clenched his jaw. "Passion? You think betrayal is passion? What about our vows, Stella? What about our children? Don't they mean anything to you?" "Don't you dare bring the kids into this," she snapped, her tone growing sharp. "I've been a good mother to them." Charles laughed bitterly. "A good mother doesn't destroy her children's family for a cheap thrill." Stella stood right in front of him, her face inches from his. Her eyes blazed. "You don't get it, do you? Nathan knows how to make a woman feel alive. He's fun, spontaneous. Maybe you should take a few lessons from him." Charles recoiled as if struck. his fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. "You're unbelievable," he whispered. "And you're predictable," she shot back, rushing past him toward the door. "Stella," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "This isn't over." She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, and turned to face him. "Oh, it is, Charles. You'll forgive me because you always do. You're too weak to do anything else." Without waiting for a response, she opened the door and left, leaving Charles standing in the room. For a long time, he stared at the empty doorway, his chest tight and his breath shallow. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make her understand the depth of her betrayal. Instead, he sank onto the bed, his head in his hands. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound he could hear. Diane and Stella were talking in the kitchen, their voices calm, as if nothing had happened. Charles sat there for hours, his thoughts racing. He had confronted her, but it didn't feel like a win. If anything, he felt more lost than before. Stella's smirk haunted him, her words echoing in his mind as the night deepened. Charles made a silent vow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stella might think she had won, but she had no idea what was coming. Charles sat on the couch in the living room, his hands clenched together as if trying to hold himself together. The weight of Stella's betrayal pressed down on him like a crushing wave. And now the confrontation with his mother was imminent. He had gone to Diane for understanding, for support, anything to steady himself in the storm. Diane entered the room, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. She placed it on the coffee table and sat across from him, her posture calm and composed. "You look like you haven't slept," she remarked, pushing a cup toward him. "I haven't," Charles admitted, his voice quiet. He stared at the tea but didn't reach for it. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Stella." Diane's expression softened. "I thought something was wrong. You've been acting strange for days." Charles drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "She's been cheating on me." Diane's hand froze halfway to her cup. "With Nathan," he added. The words came out clipped and bitter, almost choking him. For a moment, Diane said nothing. Her lips pressed tightly together, and her eyes darted toward the window. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "Charles, I need you to listen to me carefully." Charles leaned forward, looking for some sign of outrage or support on her face, but her voice took on a tone of stern authority. "Stella made a mistake," Diane said, her gaze fixed on him. "One wild night doesn't mean you throw away your marriage." Charles blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "A mistake? Mom, she's been sleeping with Nathan, your other son. How can you call that a mistake?" "It's not like she's doing it every day," Diane replied firmly. "People make mistakes, Charles. You've made them. I've made them. And now Stella has, but that doesn't mean you destroy your family over it." Charles stared at her, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a mistake, Mom. It's a betrayal, a massive, unforgivable betrayal." Diane scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Don't be so dramatic. Do you know how many marriages survive infidelity? Plenty. Think of your children, Charles. Are you really going to tear their lives apart because of one night of poor judgment?" Charles's fists tightened on his knees. "So that's it? You're telling me to just ignore it? To forgive and pretend it didn't happen?" "Yes," Diane said firmly. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. If you divorce over this, you can never call me your mother again. I won't stand by while you destroy this family over something so trivial." "Trivial?" Charles's voice rose in disbelief. "Mom, she cheated on me with my own brother. How can you sit there and defend her?" Diane's expression hardened. "Because family comes first, Charles. Always. Stella is still the mother of your children, and Nathan is your brother. Are you really going to let one mistake drive a wedge between all of us?" Charles felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "You're not serious. You can't possibly believe what you're saying." "I am serious," Diane said, folding her arms. "This family has been through enough. I won't let you ruin it over something that can be fixed." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. Stella walked into the room, her expression calm, almost smug. She must have overheard enough of the conversation to know what was going on. "Charles," she said smoothly, leaning against the doorframe, "are you really dragging your mother into this? That's low, even for you." Charles turned to face her, his anger barely contained. You think I'm the problem here? Stella smirked. Oh, I know you are. Maybe if you were half as attentive as Nathan, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Attentive? Charles repeated, his voice shaking. You've got some nerve. She shrugged and walked into the room. I'm just being honest. Nathan knows how to make a woman feel appreciated. Maybe you could learn a thing or two from him. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Get out. Get out of this room before I say something I can't take back. Stella tilted her head, feigning innocence. Oh, come on, Charles. Don't act like such a victim. You've always been so predictable. It's honestly boring. Boring? Charles's voice cracked, a mix of anger and disbelief. Boring is being faithful. Boring is raising a family and trusting your wife to do the same. Diane stood, placing herself between them. Enough, both of you, she said sharply. This isn't helping anything. Charles pointed a trembling finger at Stella. You've destroyed everything. And you. He turned to Diane. You're enabling her. How can you stand there and defend this? Diane's eyes narrowed. Because I know what's at stake, Char. Your children need a stable home. If you divorce Stella, they'll be the ones who suffer the most. They'll suffer more growing up in a house built on lies, Charles shot back. Stella laughed bitterly. Oh, please, you'd be doing them a favor by staying. You think they'll thank you for tearing everything apart? Charles's chest heaved with restrained fury. Don't talk to me about what's best for my kids. You gave up that right the moment you decided to betray me. Diane stepped closer to Charles, her tone softening slightly. Please, Charles, think about what you're doing. Don't let your pride ruin everything. It's not pride, Mom, Charles said through gritted teeth. It's dignity, something you apparently don't value. Stella scoffed. Dignity? You're so hung up on your ego that you can't see what's right in front of you. People make mistakes, Charles. Get over it. Charles stared at her, his disbelief turning into cold resolve. You know what? You're right, Stella. People make mistakes, and mine was ever trusting you in the first place. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the room. Diane called after him, but he didn't stop. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his way to the front door, slamming it shut behind him. Outside, the cool evening air touched his face, calming him slightly. He stood on the porch, staring at the quiet street. His mother's words and Stella's smugness played over and over in his mind. Family, stability, forgiveness. They had twisted those words into weapons, using them to justify the unforgivable. But Charles knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay. Not like this. Charles sat on the edge of his bed, his hands running through his hair. His mind raced as dawn began to creep through the blinds. His children, Brielle and Hunter, were sound asleep in their shared room, their gentle breaths a faint reminder of the innocence he needed to protect. The house was silent, but Charles's thoughts were loud. Stella's betrayal, Diane's ultimatum. It all swirled together into a suffocating storm. His gaze drifted to the packed duffel bag near the door, its contents carefully selected during his sleepless night. He had made up his mind. He tiptoed to the children's room, slowly opening the door. Belle was curled up under a pink blanket, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Hunter lay sprawled on his back, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm. Charles's heart ached as he stood there. I'm doing this for you, he whispered softly, leaning against the doorframe. I won't let this mess hurt you. The clock read 6:30 a.m. Diane and Stella were early risers, but had planned a shopping trip later that morning. Timing was everything. Charles knew he had a small window to leave undetected. As he prepared breakfast, toast and scrambled eggs, he heard footsteps behind him. Brielle rubbed her eyes, her hair sticking up in all directions. Daddy, she said, her voice groggy. Good morning, sweetheart, Charles said, crouching to her level. How about we have breakfast and then go on a little adventure today? Adventure? Her eyes lit up. Yep, he said, tapping her nose. Just you, me, and Hunter. A special day together, Charles said softly. By 8:30 a.m., Diane and Stella had left the house. Charles wasted no time. He quickly ushered the kids back into their room and gently but firmly told them to pack their favorite toys and clothes into their small backpacks. Are we going far? Hunter asked as he stuffed action figures into his bag. Not too far, Charles replied, zipping up his duffel. Just somewhere new, somewhere safe. Brielle frowned. Is Mommy coming? Charles hesitated, crouching down in front of her. Not this time, honey. This is just for us. Once everything was ready, Charles moved quickly, carrying the bags to the car and making one last check of the house. His eyes lingered on the wedding photo hanging in the living room, and his jaw tightened. Without a second thought, he turned off the lights and locked the door. The drive to the new apartment was quiet. Belle and Hunter, sensing the tension in their father, stayed quiet. Charles glanced at them through the rearview mirror, their small faces pressed against the windows as they watched the world blur by. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Hunter asked after a while. "To a place where we can all be happy," Charles answered, forcing a reassuring smile. The apartment was modest but clean, with 2 small bedrooms and a cozy living area. Charles had arranged the lease a few days prior, paying up front to avoid any delays. As they stepped inside, the kids wandered around, exploring their new home. "Can we put our toys here?" Brielle asked, pointing to a corner of the living room. "Of course," Charles said, kneeling to help her unpack. "This is our home now." For the rest of the morning, Charles kept busy setting up the apartment, making it feel welcoming. He laid out the kids' bedding, arranged their toys, and stocked the fridge with essentials. Around noon, Charles's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He stared at the screen. Diane. He hesitated, knowing he couldn't avoid her forever. With a sigh, he answered. "Hello? Charles." Diane's voice was frantic. "Where are you? What's going on?" "I'm not coming back, Mom," Charles replied calmly. "What do you mean?" "Stella just called me. She said the house is empty and the kids are gone." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what's best for my children," Charles said firmly. "They deserve better than to grow up in that house." Diane's tone shifted to frustration. "You're being selfish, Charles. Do you have any idea what this will do to your children, to Stella, to me?" "I know exactly what it'll do," Charles replied evenly. "And I've made my decision." "You're making a mistake," Diane hissed. "Mark my words, you'll regret this." "I've already made too many mistakes," Charles said before hanging up. He turned the phone to silent and set it face down on the counter. The afternoon passed peacefully. Charles played board games with the kids and read them stories, trying to bury the turmoil brewing inside him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control, a feeling that he was doing the right thing. But just as they sat down for dinner, his phone vibrated again. This time, the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello? Is this Charles?" a woman's voice asked, professional yet urgent. "Yes, this is Charles. This is Nurse Avery from St. Mary's Hospital. We have your mother and wife here in the emergency room. There's been an accident. You need to come immediately." Charles's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "I can't discuss the details over the phone," the nurse said gently, "but I recommend you come as soon as possible." For a moment, Charles stood frozen, his mind racing. He glanced at his children, who were giggling over a spilled drink, blissfully unaware. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll be there soon." As he hung up, Charles felt a familiar weight settle on his chest. He had wanted distance from the chaos, but now it seemed that the chaos had followed him. He stood in the living room, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind churning with questions. What kind of accident? How serious was it? Did he even care? "Daddy?" Brielle's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" Charles forced a smile and knelt to her level. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just have to step out for a bit. Miss Stella from next door will come stay with you and Hunter, okay?" Brielle nodded, her brow furrowing. "You'll come back always?" Charles kissed her forehead as he grabbed his keys. "Always." As he headed for the door, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited him at the hospital would change everything yet again. Charles drove into the hospital, his pulse pounding in his ears. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit him as he passed the front desk, barely glancing at the nurse who pointed him toward the waiting area. He spotted Diane and Stella immediately. Diane was pacing, her face pale and drawn, while Stella sat hunched in a chair, her hands clutching a tissue that she twisted nervously. The moment Diane saw him, she rushed forward. "Charles!" she cried, gripping his arm. "Thank God you're here!" Charles shrugged her off, his expression cold. "What happened?" Diane's lip quivered, and tears welled in her eyes. "It's Nathan," she choked out. "He had an accident. A bad one." Charles's jaw tightened. "What kind of accident?" Diane hesitated, unsure whether to say more. Stella stood and took a hesitant step toward him, her face streaked with tears. "We were driving back from the mall," she began, her voice trembling. "He lost control of the car. They say it was a blowout." Charles's stomach twisted, but his expression remained impassive. "Is he alive?" "Not dying, but barely," Stella said, dabbing her eyes with the tissue. He's in surgery right now. Charles crossed his arms, glancing between them. And what does this have to do with me? Charles, please, Stella said, reaching for his hand. He stepped back, her fingers grasping at the empty air. We need you. We've all made mistakes, but we're still family. Nathan needs us now. I need you. Charles laughed bitterly, the sound slicing through the tension like a knife. Family? You're seriously going to use that word right now? Stella flinched, her tears flowing freely. I know we've hurt you, but can't you see this is bigger than all of us? We have to come together. Come together? Charles's voice rose, drawing the attention of a passing nurse. Do you even hear yourself? You tore this family apart with your lies and betrayal, and now you want to pretend it never happened? Diane stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. Charles, please, she said softly. I know you're angry, but this isn't the time to hold grudges. Nathan's life is hanging by a thread. Charles turned to her, his eyes narrowing. You don't get to lecture me about family, Mom. You defended her. You enabled this mess, and now you expect me to play the dutiful son and husband? Number, I'm done. Diane's face crumpled, but before she could respond, Stella fell to her knees, sobbing. I was wrong, Charles. I was selfish and stupid, and I ruined everything. But please, please don't walk away. I'll do anything to fix this. Charles glared at her, his face unchanged. Anything? He asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Like stop lying? Stop blaming me for your mistakes? Somehow? I don't think so. Stella reached for his leg, her desperation clear. Please, Charles, I'm begging you, don't let us fall apart. Charles stepped back, her hands sliding off him. He looked at Diane, then at Stella, his gaze hardening. You want forgiveness? You want me to forget everything you've done? Sorry, but that's not happening. A heavy silence filled the room as Stella's sobs grew louder. Diane stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Charles took a deep breath and turned toward the hallway leading to the surgical wing. Where is he? He asked flatly. Diane shakily pointed. The ICU waiting area. They'll let us know when he's out of surgery. Without another word, Charles walked away. The ICU waiting room was cold and silent, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. Charles sat in a corner, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor. He hadn't come for Nathan, at least, not really. He wasn't sure why he was there at all. His thoughts wandered to his children, safe in their new apartment. They were his only reason to stay grounded, to not let the betrayal consume him completely. The door opened, and Diane entered, her steps hesitant. She sat beside him, leaving a space between them. Charles, she began softly. Don't, he interrupted. She sighed, twisting her wedding ring. I know I've hurt you. I know I failed as a mother by not supporting you when you needed me most. But Nathan, he's still your brother. Charles looked at her, his expression unreadable. And what does that mean to me now? Diane's voice cracked. It means there's still a chance to make things right for all of us. Charles shook his head, a humorless smile tugging at his lips. You still don't get it, do you? Some things can't be fixed. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. Before Diane could reply, a doctor entered the room. He was tall and tired-looking, his scrubs stained with blood. Family of Nathan Blake? He asked. Diane and Charles both stood. How is he? Diane asked anxiously. The doctor sighed, removing his surgical cap. We managed to stabilize him, but he's in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial. Diane clasped her hands together, whispering a prayer under her breath. Charles, however, remained silent, his face unreadable. Can we see him? Diane asked. The doctor nodded. One at a time for a few minutes. Diane turned to Charles. Do you want to go first? No, Charles said bluntly. You go. As Diane followed the doctor down the hallway, Charles sat back down, his mind racing. He didn't know what he felt. Anger, pity, indifference. It all mixed together, leaving him hollow. When Diane returned, her face streaked with tears, she spoke quietly. He's asking for you. Charles hesitated, then stood. He wasn't sure what compelled him to go. Perhaps curiosity, or maybe he needed closure. Nathan lay in the hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him. His face was pale, his eyes barely open. Charles, he rasped, his voice weak. Charles stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. Nathan. I'm sorry, Nathan said, his voice cracking. I messed up. I hurt you. Charles interrupted. Don't waste your breath. We both know sorry doesn't fix this. Nathan's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to make things right. Charles shook his head, his jaw tightening. You made your choices, Nathan. Now you have to live with them. Nathan closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Charles turned and walked out of the room, leaving the past behind him. Back in the waiting room, Diane and Stella looked at him expectantly. Well? Stella asked. Charles stared at her, his expression unreadable. I've said everything I needed to say. Without another word, he walked out of the hospital, his steps resolute. He didn't look back. The days dragged on for Diane and Stella, each one serving as a reminder of their fall from grace. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with silence. Bills piled up on the dining table, unopened. One morning, Diane sat at the table, her hands trembling as she calculated expenses against the meager savings she had left. We're going to have to sell more of the jewelry, Diane muttered, not looking up. Stella, sitting across from her, rubbed her temples. What's left to sell? You've already pawned your bracelets, and I sold my wedding ring. Diane sighed heavily, her eyes misting. We wouldn't be in this mess if Charles hadn't been so stubborn. Stella slammed her hand on the table. Stubborn? You mean if he hadn't left after we... She stopped mid-sentence, realizing her words were digging her into a deeper hole. Diane glared at her. Don't say it, don't even think it. We just have to get through this, Stella, for Nathan. Nathan was recovering at a rehabilitation facility, his once vibrant energy now dulled by weeks of surgeries and therapy. He spent most of his time in a wheelchair, staring out the window at the bleak courtyard. The accident had left him with a permanent limp, and the painkillers barely took the edge off. One afternoon, Stella visited him, carrying a bag of homemade sandwiches, though homemade was a stretch, considering the empty fridge back home. Hey, she said softly, setting the bag on the table next to him. Nathan turned his head slowly, his face gaunt. Stella, he said flatly, what do you want? She flinched at his tone but sat down anyway. I'll make you something to eat. You need your strength. He snorted, shaking his head. Strength for what? Look at me, Stella. I'm a joke. I can't even stand for more than a few minutes without feeling like my legs are going to give out. You'll get better, Stella said, her voice trembling. Nathan's eyes narrowed. We both know that's not true. And even if I did, what do I have to go back to? No job, no money, no family worth calling one. Stella looked away, her eyes filling with tears. We'll figure it out, Nathan scoffed. Together? Don't make me laugh. You're just as lost as I am. Meanwhile, Charles's life had taken a completely different path. He poured all his energy into rebuilding his and his children's lives. His modest apartment had transformed into a warm, welcoming home filled with laughter and the scent of home-cooked meals. Daddy, look, Brielle said one evening, holding up a drawing she had made at school. It was a picture of their new family, her, Hunter, and Charles, all smiling under a bright sun. That's beautiful, sweetheart, Charles said, crouching down to her level. I'll put it on the fridge. Can we get ice cream tonight? Hunter's eyes lit up. Please, he said eagerly. Charles chuckled. Ice cream on a school night? I don't know. Please, both kids chorused, their faces lighting up. All right, Charles relented, ruffling Hunter's hair, but only if you finish your homework first. At work, Charles had thrown himself into his career, and his boss noticed his renewed focus, rewarding him with a promotion that came with a significant raise. The extra income allowed him to enroll Brielle and Hunter in after-school activities, something they had missed while living under the stress of his previous life. You're doing great, Linda, his co-worker said one afternoon as they reviewed a project together. Thanks, Charles replied, glancing at the clock. I just want to make sure everything's set before I head out. Is it Hunter's soccer practice today? Linda smiled. You're a good dad, Charles. Your kids are lucky to have you. He nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his life. Back at Diane's house, things were falling apart. The electricity had been shut off for a week before they could scrape together enough money to pay the bill. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for a half carton of milk and a loaf of bread. Diane and Stella sat in the dimly lit living room, the only light coming from a single candle. This can't go on, Diane said, her voice hollow. What do you want me to do? Stella snapped. Diane stared at her, her lips pressed into a thin line. We could call Charles. Stella froze, the suggestion hanging in the air like an omen. You really think he'd help us after everything? He's not heartless, Diane said, though her voice lacked conviction. Stella shook her head. He's done with us, and honestly, I don't blame him. Nathan's condition continued to weigh heavily on them. One evening, Diane visited him at the rehab center. "Mom," Nathan said weakly as she entered the room. "You didn't have to come." "I'm your mother," Diane said firmly, sitting beside him. "Of course I had to come." Nathan looked down at his hands, his expression filled with defeat. "I screwed up, didn't I?" Tears filled Diane's eyes. "We all did, Nathan. But we have to find a way to move forward." "How?" Nathan asked, his voice cracking. "Charles is gone. He hates me. He hates all of us." Diane reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "We can't give up on each other, Nathan. That's all we have left." As the months passed, Charles began to find joy again. One sunny Saturday, he took Brielle and Hunter to the park. They played on the swings, ran through the grass, and laughed until their sides ached. Watching them, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time, he realized he didn't need the family he had left behind. He had everything he needed right here. "Daddy," Brielle said as they sat on a bench eating ice cream. "Are we happy now?" Charles smiled and pulled her into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, we're very happy." Just then, sunlight poured into the cozy cafe where Charles sat across from Veronica, a woman he had met through a mutual friend. Their conversations had started simply, a shared laugh here, a kind word there. But over time, they had grown into something deeper. "You're awfully quiet today," Veronica said, her voice warm but curious as she stirred her tea, her hazel eyes fixed on him. Charles smiled faintly and leaned back in his chair. "Just thinking. It's been a long road to get here." Veronica tilted her head, her brows knitting slightly. "Do you mean here, with me, or just here in life?" "Both," Charles replied thoughtfully. "I wasn't sure I'd ever trust anyone again, but you've made me see things differently." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Charles, you don't have to say anything. I can see it in how you treat your kids, how you carry yourself. You've been through hell, but you didn't let it break you." He chuckled softly. "I had no choice. My kids deserve better, and I wasn't going to let them down." Their relationship blossomed naturally. Veronica wasn't flashy or overbearing. She was steady, kind, and patient. She respected Charles's boundaries, never pushing him to share more than he was comfortable with. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Charles noticed Brielle and Hunter running ahead, their laughter filling the air. "They've grown so much," Veronica said, her voice tinged with admiration. Charles nodded, watching his children fondly. "They're my everything. They've been my anchor through all of this." "And you've been theirs," Veronica said, squeezing his hand. "You've built something beautiful, Charles. You should be proud of yourself." Life with Veronica brought a lightness Charles hadn't felt in years. They took things slow, allowing their connection to deepen without rushing into anything. For the first time, Charles felt the stirrings of hope, a hope for a future where love wasn't synonymous with pain. One day, Veronica invited him over for dinner. As they cooked together, the kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and roasted vegetables. Charles found himself smiling more than he had in years. "Careful, the past is boiling over," Veronica teased, nudging him with her elbow. Charles laughed, grabbing a towel to wipe up the mess. "Guess I'm out of practice. It's been a while since I cooked anything fancy." "Well, it's never too late to learn," she said, grinning. Their laughter echoed through the kitchen, a sound Charles hadn't realized he missed so much. Meanwhile, Diane and Stella's lives continued to spiral. The house had been sold to cover mounting debts, and they now shared a cramped apartment in a less desirable part of town. Nathan, still struggling with his health, had cut ties with both women, leaving them to fend for themselves. Stella stared at the stack of bills on the coffee table, her hands trembling. "I can't believe this is my life," she muttered. Diane, sitting across from her, sighed heavily. "If Charles had just forgiven us." Stella shot her a glare. "You think this is his fault? We did this to ourselves, Diane. You defended me when you shouldn't have." "I betrayed him. What did we expect?" Diane's face hardened. "I expected him to put family first. But no, he had to play the victim." "Maybe because he was the victim," Stella snapped, her voice rising. "You think he didn't have every right to leave? Look at what we did to him." The argument ended in silence, both women too exhausted to continue. Occasionally, Diane or Stella would call Charles, their voices dripping with desperation. "Charles, it's your mother," Diane said one afternoon, her voice strained. I wanted to see how you're doing, and the kids. I miss them." Charles leaned against the kitchen counter, his grip tightening on the phone. "You miss them now? Funny. You didn't think about them when you were defending Stella's betrayal." Diane began to cry softly. "I know I was wrong. I know I failed you, but I'm begging you, Charles. Please, let us be a family again. Charles's tone remained steady but firm. You chose your side, Mom. You chose to enable Stella instead of standing by me. I've moved on, and so have my kids. Don't call again. He hung up before she could respond, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Years passed, and Charles's life continued to flourish. He and Veronica eventually decided to marry, blending their lives in a way that felt seamless and right. The wedding was a small, intimate affair attended by close friends and family. Brielle and Hunter stood by their father's side, their smiles as wide as his. Are you happy, Dad? Hunter asked later that evening as they sat on the porch of their new home. Charles looked at his son, his heart swelling with love. I'm more than happy, buddy. I'm at peace. Brielle leaned against his arm. We're happy too. Veronica's really nice. Charles kissed the top of her head. I'm glad you think so. She's a big part of why we're all happy now. One day, as Charles watched his children play in the backyard, Veronica joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. They're amazing, aren't they? She said, nodding toward Brielle and Hunter. They are, Charles agreed, his eyes never leaving his kids. Veronica leaned her head on his shoulder. You did this, Charles. You gave them a life full of love and security, and you gave yourself one too.